Silence can become louder than words when someone has grown accustomed to hearing from you. The moment your message and explanation disappear and your emotional reactions become harder to reach, the entire dynamic can change. A person who once knew exactly how to get your attention may suddenly face a question they cannot answer so easily. Why did his behavior change? That question is where the psychology of silence begins. Most people think ignoring someone is simply about withholding attention. The deeper reality is far complicated. Attention creates expectations. Repeated communication creates patterns. Emotional reactions create feedback. When those patterns suddenly disappear, the mind begins searching for an explanation. It starts reviewing conversations, noticing details, and assigning meaning to the change. This is one reason silence can have such a powerful psychological effect. The absence of a familiar response can create uncertainty, and uncertainty can make people focus more intensely on a relationship. But there is a darker side to this idea. Silence can be used as a weapon, or it can be used as a form of emotional control. Those two things may look similar from the outside, but psychologically they are very different. One comes from desperation and the desire to control another person. The other comes from self-respect and the ability to regulate your own emotions. In this video, we are going deeper than the usual advice about ignoring a woman to make her chase you. We are going to examine what actually happens psychologically when a man stops chasing, stops over-explaining, stops seeking reassurance, and stops reacting to every emotional trigger. You will learn why sudden changes in attention can create uncertainty, why unpredictable communication can capture attention so strongly, how social exclusion affects the human mind, and why emotional regulation can completely change the way a relationship feels. You will also learn the difference between healthy distance and the silent treatment, because this distinction is often ignored in popular discussions about dark psychology. Taking space after an emotional situation can protect your judgment. Deliberately withholding communication to create fear can damage trust and emotional security. Understanding that difference gives you a much stronger form of control. Instead of trying to control another person's emotions, you learn how to control your own reactions. There is another psychological detail that makes this subject even more interesting. People often pay greater attention to changes in a pattern than to the pattern itself. When someone has become used to regular messages, quick replies, emotional reassurance, or constant availability, those behaviors can become psychologically predictable. Predictability creates a sense of stability. Then the pattern changes. The person who was always available becomes less available. The person who explained everything becomes quiet. The person who reacted immediately begins responding calmly or chooses to step away. The mind now has a gap to fill. That gap can create questions. It can increase attention. It can make previous interactions feel more important. A conversation that seemed ordinary yesterday can suddenly be examined from 10 different angles today. This is where uncertainty becomes powerful. The human mind dislikes incomplete information because incomplete information makes prediction difficult. When the reason behind a change is unclear, people may spend more mental energy trying to understand it. But there is a critical point you need to understand before going deeper. Silence does not automatically create attraction. Ignoring a woman does not guarantee that she will chase you. Human behavior is far too complex for a simple trick like that. Personality matters. Relationship history matters. Emotional attachment matters. The quality of the connection matters. The reason for the distance matters. In some situations, silence can increase curiosity. In others, it can create disappointment, anger, emotional distance, or complete disengagement. That is why the real lesson is deeper than learning how to disappear. The real lesson is learning how to stop giving your emotional power away every time another person changes their behavior. Think about what happens when your emotional reactions become predictable. Someone knows exactly which words will make you defensive. They know how to make you explain yourself. They know that if they become distant, you will chase. They know that if they criticize you, you will try to prove yourself. They know that if they become cold, you will become more available. This creates a pattern. Your reactions become part of the dynamic. Once you understand that, emotional control takes on a completely different meaning. Control does not mean becoming cold. It means creating enough space between feeling and action to choose your response. You can feel anger without sending the angry message. You can feel anxiety without demanding reassurance. You can feel rejected without begging someone to stay. You can feel confused without desperately trying to force an explanation. That pause is where emotional strength develops. And this is where the psychology becomes darker. Silence can expose how much of a relationship depended on your constant effort. When you stop carrying every conversation, you may discover who actually wants to communicate. When you stop initiating every interaction, you may see whether the other person reaches toward you. When you stop explaining every decision, you may discover whether someone respects your boundaries or simply prefers having access to you. Silence can create space for observation. Instead of constantly trying to influence the outcome, you begin watching behavior. That shift is extremely important because people can say almost anything when they want to preserve an image. Consistent behavior is harder to fake for long periods. You will also discover why emotional availability and personal value are closely connected in the way people perceive relationships. Being available can be healthy when it comes from genuine care. Constant availability becomes different when it comes from fear. There is a major difference between giving attention because you want to and giving attention because you are terrified of losing someone. One comes from choice. The other comes from emotional dependence. When you understand that difference, silence stops being a strategy designed to make another person uncomfortable. It becomes a boundary. You stop responding automatically. You stop chasing every change in mood. You stop turning every disagreement into an emergency. You allow conversations to breathe. You allow people to reveal their intentions through their actions. And perhaps the most important lesson is the one most people miss. The real power of silence is rarely about making another person wonder where you are. It is about reaching a point where you no longer need another person's reaction to feel secure. That is emotional independence. It means your confidence does not rise and fall with someone's attention. Their approval can feel good, but you do not depend on it. Their distance can hurt, but it does not destroy your identity. Their silence can create questions, but it does not force you into desperate behavior. You become capable of sitting with uncertainty without immediately trying to eliminate it. Throughout this video, we are going to uncover the psychology behind that transformation. We will explore how attention shapes expectations, why uncertainty can intensify focus, how social exclusion can affect self-esteem and belonging, why emotional regulation changes relationship dynamics, and how perceived relational value can shift when patterns of availability change. We will also expose the dangerous line between emotional control and emotional manipulation. By the end, you will understand why the strongest person in a difficult interaction is often the person who can remain calm while everyone else is reacting. You will understand why over-explaining can weaken your position, why chasing clarity can sometimes create more confusion, and why stepping back can reveal information that constant communication hides. So stay with this video until the end, because the final lesson changes the entire meaning of silence. The goal is never to become cruel, distant, or emotionally unavailable just to make someone chase you. The goal is to become so emotionally disciplined that another person's behavior no longer controls your behavior. When you reach that point, silence becomes different. It becomes calm. It becomes intentional. It becomes a space where you can observe instead of react, think instead of panic, and choose instead of chase. And once you understand that difference, you will see silence through a completely different psychological lens. Welcome to our channel, where we explore human behavior, emotional control, psychology, relationships, and the hidden patterns that influence the way people think and act. If you want to understand the psychology behind attention, attraction, emotional reactions, boundaries, and human behavior, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. The deeper you go into psychology, the more you realize that power is often found in the moments when you choose what you will no longer react to. Uncertainty has a strange effect on the human mind. When a familiar pattern suddenly changes, the mind rarely accepts the change quietly. It begins looking for a reason. A message that used to arrive every morning suddenly disappears. A person who once replied quickly becomes slower. Conversations that once felt natural become shorter. The difference may seem small from the outside, yet internally, it can create a much larger reaction because the mind is trying to understand what changed. This is where silence becomes psychologically powerful. The problem is rarely silence itself. The deeper issue is the unanswered question behind it. Why did his behavior change? Did something happen? Is he losing interest? Did she say something wrong? Is he becoming emotionally distant? Has he met someone else? Is he simply busy? Or is he deliberately creating distance? When there is no clear answer, the mind starts filling the empty space with possibilities. Psychologists often describe uncertainty as uncomfortable because people prefer situations they can understand and predict. Predictability gives the mind a sense of control. When you know where you stand with someone, you can decide how to respond. When their behavior becomes difficult to interpret, that certainty disappears. The mind then starts gathering information. Old conversations may suddenly receive new meaning. A short reply from last week may be remembered. A change in tone may become important. A delayed response may be analyzed. A small disagreement may be replayed mentally. The person may begin connecting details that seemed completely unrelated before. This does not mean the mind is discovering the truth. It means the mind is trying to create a story that explains the uncertainty. That distinction matters because the explanation created in someone's head can be very different from reality. This is one reason silence can create such a strong psychological effect. When you explain to everything, you remove much of the uncertainty. You tell someone why you are busy. You explain why you need space. You reassure them about how you feel. You answer every question immediately. You provide context for every change in your behavior. The other person receives information, and the mind has less reason to search. But when communication suddenly becomes limited, the information disappears. The unanswered space becomes larger. The mind may begin searching for clues because it wants to restore a sense of certainty. Research into social exclusion has found that people who experience exclusion without understanding why can experience stronger threats to their sense of belonging and self-esteem. The lack of an explanation can therefore make the experience more difficult to process because the person has fewer psychological tools for understanding what happened. There is also an important difference between healthy uncertainty and deliberate emotional manipulation. A man who becomes quiet because he needs time to regulate his emotions is doing something very different from a man who deliberately disappears to make a woman panic. The behavior may look similar for a short period, but the intention and emotional consequences can be completely different. Healthy silence creates space for self-control. Manipulative silence attempts to control another person's emotional state. One says, in effect, I need time to think clearly. The other communicates through fear, confusion, or punishment. This distinction becomes especially important when discussing dark psychology, because psychological knowledge can easily be turned into a collection of tricks. Real emotional control is far more disciplined than that. When a man stops chasing, the uncertainty can also reveal how much of the previous connection depended on his constant effort. If he was always initiating conversations, repairing disagreements, asking questions, sending messages, and providing reassurance, his sudden withdrawal changes the entire pattern. The woman may begin noticing the absence because the previous behavior had become familiar. She may wonder why he is quieter. She may question whether his feelings have changed. She may reconsider previous interactions. She may even reach out simply because the old pattern has been interrupted. Yet none of this guarantees attraction. Some people respond to uncertainty by moving closer. Others respond by protecting themselves and moving away. Personality, attachment patterns, previous experiences, emotional security, and the quality of the relationship can all influence the response. This is why silence should never be treated as a guaranteed psychological button. Human beings are individuals, and the same behavior can create completely different reactions. Someone who feels secure may simply respect the distance. Someone who has experienced abandonment may become anxious. Someone who has already lost interest may feel relieved. Someone who is deeply invested may become more curious. The silence itself does not determine the response. The meaning the person gives to that silence matters. And that meaning is shaped by everything that happened before it. The deeper psychological lesson is that people often react to the meaning of an event rather than the event alone. A delayed message can mean nothing when the relationship is stable. The same delayed message can feel significant after weeks of emotional tension. A quiet evening can feel peaceful between two secure people. The same silence can feel threatening when one person already suspects rejection. This is why context matters so much. Silence enters an existing emotional environment. It interacts with previous experiences, expectations, attachment, trust, and perceived security. The mind then tries to interpret the change using all of that information. There is another subtle effect worth understanding. When someone is curious about another person's feelings, attention can become concentrated on that person. The mind begins monitoring. Is he online? Did he see the message? Why did he respond that way? Why did his tone change? Did he seem different today? This increased monitoring can make the person occupy more mental space, even though the person is physically absent. That is one of the paradoxes of silence. Reduced communication can sometimes increase mental attention because the brain is trying to solve an unresolved question. The absence of information becomes information in itself. And when a person cannot immediately determine what that absence means, the search for an explanation can continue long after the conversation has ended. Silence and the silent treatment can look almost identical from the outside, yet psychologically, they can represent two completely different behaviors. This is where many conversations about dark psychology become misleading. The internet often presents ignoring someone as a secret weapon, as though disappearing for a certain amount of time will automatically create attraction, fear, or obsession. Real human psychology is far more complicated. Silence itself is neutral. Its meaning depends on the reason behind it, the pattern surrounding it, and the emotional intention driving it. A man who steps away because he feels overwhelmed is making a very different choice from a man who deliberately refuses to communicate because he wants another person to suffer. Both may become quiet, but the psychological process behind that quietness is completely different. Consider the difference between saying, "I need some time to clear my head," and simply disappearing while deliberately watching the other person become anxious. The first behavior communicates a boundary. It creates space for emotional regulation. When emotions become intense, immediate communication can sometimes make the situation worse. Anger can produce harsh words. Anxiety can produce excessive messages. Fear of rejection can produce desperate attempts to regain reassurance. Taking a pause can interrupt that cycle. The person steps away from the emotional reaction and gives the nervous system time to settle. Once the intensity decreases, communication can become more thoughtful and controlled. In this sense, silence can be a form of self-management rather than a weapon. The silent treatment works differently when the intention is punishment. The person may deliberately withhold communication to create discomfort, anxiety, guilt, or fear. There may be an expectation that the other person will eventually apologize, chase, plead, or become emotionally distressed. The silence is then being used to influence another person's behavior. This is where emotional control can cross into manipulation. The purpose is no longer simply to create personal space. The purpose becomes making another person experience the consequences of losing access to you. That distinction is easy to overlook because both behaviors involve reduced communication, but intention changes the psychological meaning. Research examining the silent treatment and related forms of ostracism has found associations with emotional distress, poorer psychological well-being, and lower relationship satisfaction. Persistent withdrawal can create uncertainty about the relationship and can make a person question whether they are valued, accepted, or emotionally safe. Human beings have a deep need for connection and belonging. When communications is suddenly removed, especially without explanation, that need can feel threatened. The person may begin searching for answers, monitoring behavior, and questioning their own actions. Over time, repeated silent treatment can create emotional exhaustion because the relationship becomes difficult to predict. Instead of feeling like a place of security, it begins to feel like a place where affection and communication can suddenly disappear. This is why mastering silence requires emotional discipline. You should be able to step back without turning your distance into punishment. You should be able to become less available without creating deliberate confusion. You should be able to refuse an argument without trying to make the other person feel powerless. That is a much stronger form of emotional control because it begins with controlling yourself. When someone provokes you, you do not have to react immediately. When someone becomes disrespectful, you do not have to prove your worth. When a conversation becomes emotionally unhealthy, you can create distance without turning that distance into a psychological game. The darker and more intelligent lesson is that silence should reveal your boundaries rather than hide your intentions. If you need space, take space. If you are finished with an unhealthy dynamic, leave it. If you need time to think, communicate that clearly. There is strength in saying less when every extra word would come from anger, fear, or desperation. There is also strength in knowing when communication is necessary. Emotional maturity is not about becoming silent all the time. It is about knowing when speaking helps and when speaking only feeds the cycle. A person who depends on the silent treatment needs another person's emotional reaction to feel powerful. A person who practices emotional regulation does not need that reaction. That difference may be invisible at first, but it becomes obvious over time. One person keeps checking whether the other is suffering, wondering whether the punishment is working. The other simply returns to their own life, regulates their emotions, and decides what kind of communication deserves their attention. One is still emotionally attached to the outcome. The other is creating genuine emotional independence. That is where silence becomes less about controlling another person and more about refusing to be controlled by the emotional pressure of the moment. The real power begins when the focus moves away from controlling another person and returns to controlling yourself. This is where emotional control becomes far more powerful than simply ignoring someone. Ignoring someone can be easy when the goal is to create a reaction. You stop replying because you want them to wonder where you are. You become distant because you want them to feel your absence. You wait for them to reach out because you want proof that they care. In that situation, your behavior still depends on the other person's reaction. You may appear calm on the outside, but internally you are still watching, waiting, and measuring the result. Emotional control works differently. You step back because you refuse to let another person's behavior dictate your emotional state. Your peace becomes independent from their response. Emotional regulation is the foundation of this ability. Every person experiences anger, jealousy, disappointment, fear, attraction, insecurity, and frustration. Emotional strength does not mean eliminating these feelings. It means creating enough space between the feeling and the action. You can feel angry without sending an aggressive message. You can feel rejected without begging for reassurance. You can feel ignored without immediately demanding an explanation. You can feel tempted to chase without actually chasing. That small pause can completely change the direction of an interaction. Instead of allowing emotion to become behavior, you observe the emotion first. You recognize what is happening inside you, and then you choose what deserves your response. This is where impulse control becomes important. An emotional impulse often demands immediate action. The mind says, respond now. Explain yourself now. Send another message. Ask why she changed. Prove that you still matter. Get the last word. Defend yourself. But immediate action is often driven by the desire to reduce emotional discomfort rather than solve the actual problem. A delayed response gives you time to separate the emotional urge from the useful action. Sometimes the right response becomes obvious after the intensity disappears. Sometimes you realize that no response is necessary. Sometimes you discover that the issue was far smaller than it felt in the first few minutes. Delayed response is therefore different from deliberate ignoring. One is based on regulation. The other can be based on punishment. When you delay a response because you need to think clearly, you are protecting your judgment. When you delay a response because you want someone to become anxious, you are trying to influence their emotions. The behavior may look identical from the outside, but the psychological foundation is completely different. The first creates independence. The second creates another form of emotional dependence because you are still waiting for a reaction. Self-respect strengthens this process. When you respect yourself, you stop believing that every change in someone's attention requires an emergency response. You stop treating another person's approval as evidence of your value. You can appreciate someone's affection without making it the foundation of your identity. You can care deeply and still maintain boundaries. You can want someone and still refuse to chase behavior that repeatedly makes you feel small. This is where internal validation becomes powerful. Your sense of worth begins inside you instead of depending entirely on how another person responds. A man with internal validation does not need to create jealousy to feel valuable. He does not need to disappear simply to test someone's feelings. He does not need to win every argument. He does not need to prove that he can walk away. His behavior becomes calmer because his identity is no longer hanging from another person's reaction. That calmness can completely change the emotional atmosphere of a relationship. Instead of reacting to every shift, he observes the pattern. Instead of asking, "How can I make her react?" he starts asking, "What does her behavior tell me?" That question creates a much stronger position because it moves attention from manipulation to understanding. This is the philosophical center of emotional control. Power is often misunderstood as the ability to make another person do something. Real psychological strength can be the ability to experience intense emotion without becoming controlled by it. You can feel the urge to chase and still remain still. You can feel anger and still speak with control. You can feel uncertainty and still continue living your life. You can experience rejection without turning it into a judgment about your entire identity. The emotion can exist without becoming your master. That is why silence becomes powerful when it comes from control rather than desperation. Desperate silence is still focused on the other person. It waits for a message. It checks for a reaction. It measures whether the strategy works. Controlled silence is different. It gives you room to think. It protects your attention. It prevents emotional impulses from deciding your next move. You are no longer using silence to control someone else's mind. You are using restraint to protect your own. And once you understand that difference, silence stops being a trick and becomes a form of emotional discipline. When you stop chasing, the relationship often becomes easier to understand because the constant effort that was keeping everything moving is suddenly removed. For a long time, one person may have been sending the first message, checking in throughout the day, starting conversations, repairing disagreements, asking questions, offering reassurance, and trying to keep the connection alive even when the other person was giving very little in return. This pattern can become so normal that neither person fully notices it. The person doing most of the pursuing may believe the relationship is naturally active, when in reality, much of that activity is being created by their own effort. Then the behavior changes. The messages become less frequent. The unnecessary check-ins disappear. Arguments are no longer followed by long explanations. You stop trying to convince someone to understand your value. You stop forcing conversations that feel one-sided. Suddenly, the relationship has to stand on its own. That is where the real dynamic can begin to reveal itself. If communication continues naturally, there may have been genuine mutual interest underneath the previous pattern. If the connection becomes completely silent, you may discover that your effort was carrying far more of the relationship than you realized. This does not automatically mean the other person never cared. People have different communication styles, different emotional needs, different levels of availability, and different ways of expressing interest. But a repeated pattern can still provide useful information. When you stop doing all the emotional work, you create an opportunity to observe what happens without constantly influencing the outcome. This is why stopping the chase should never be treated as a trick designed to make a woman run after you. The deeper purpose is discovery. You are removing pressure from the interaction and allowing behavior to become clearer. Instead of asking, "How can I make her miss me?" you begin asking, "What happens when I stop carrying this connection by myself?" That question changes everything. It moves you away from manipulation and toward observation. You are no longer trying to manufacture a reaction. You are allowing the relationship to show you its natural level of reciprocity. This also connects to the psychology of perceived value. People can become accustomed to what is consistently available. When someone's attention is always present, their messages always arrive, and their availability rarely changes, that attention can begin to feel ordinary. It becomes part of the background of everyday life. When availability changes, the person may suddenly note what was previously taken for granted. The change can make attention feel more significant because the pattern is different. Yet this does not mean scarcity automatically creates attraction. Becoming unavailable cannot manufacture genuine feelings where none exist. It can simply make an existing dynamic easier to see. Perceived value can be influenced by many factors beyond availability. Consistency matters because reliable behavior creates trust. Independence matters because a person with their own goals, friendships, interests, and responsibilities does not appear emotionally dependent on one relationship. Confidence matters because it affects how someone carries themselves and responds to pressure. Emotional stability matters because constant emotional reactions can create instability within a connection. Personal boundaries matter because they communicate that access to your time and attention has meaning. Social status can also influence perception in certain environments. Although status alone cannot create genuine emotional connection, this leads to one of the most important distinctions in the entire subject. Being valuable is different from pretending to be unavailable. A person who is genuinely busy, independent, emotionally stable, and focused on their own life does not need to perform distance. Their attention naturally has limits because their life contains other priorities. A person who constantly checks their phone while pretending to be too busy to respond is still emotionally controlled by the interaction. The appearance of scarcity means very little when the mind remains completely focused on whether the other person noticed. True independence looks different. You can care about someone while continuing to live your own life. You can enjoy communication without needing constant communication. You can be available without being permanently accessible. You can respond with warmth without abandoning your boundaries. You can step back without secretly waiting for the other person to panic. This creates a healthier form of perceived value because your attention comes from choice rather than fear. And when you stop chasing from that position, the relationship begins to reveal whether both people are actually willing to move toward each other, or whether one person was simply doing all the moving before. Perceived value is one of the most misunderstood ideas in attraction and relationships, because people often reduce it to a simple formula: become scarce and people will want you more. Human psychology is far more complex than that. Scarcity can influence attention. Scarcity alone cannot create genuine attraction. When someone has been constantly available, their presence can become familiar. Their messages arrive regularly. Their attention is predictable. Their help is always there. Their availability becomes part of the normal rhythm of the relationship. When that pattern changes, the change itself can become noticeable. A person may suddenly recognize how much attention they had been receiving, because the familiar pattern has been interrupted. This does not mean their feelings have magically become stronger. It means their perception of the situation has changed, because the information they were receiving has changed. Availability plays an important role because attention has limits. A person who gives every minute of their day to another person may eventually communicate a very different message from someone who has a full life and chooses when to give their attention. Constant availability can sometimes create emotional dependence when it comes from fear of losing someone. Healthy availability comes from choice. You can respond because you genuinely want to. You can spend time with someone because you enjoy their company. You can help because you care. But you can also become unavailable when you have responsibilities, goals, friendships, rest, or personal priorities. That balance creates a healthier form of value because your attention is meaningful without becoming a performance. Consistency is equally important. Someone who disappears for days and then suddenly becomes intensely affectionate may create uncertainty, but uncertainty is not the same as value. In fact, inconsistent behavior can eventually damage trust. Genuine value is often connected to predictable character. Your words match actions. Boundaries remain stable. Your attitude does not completely change depending on whether you are receiving attention. You can be calm when things are going well and still remain calm when someone becomes distant. This kind of consistency creates a sense of reliability. And reliability can become far more meaningful than temporary excitement. Independence also changes how attention is perceived. A person who has their own goals, interests, friendships, responsibilities, and ambitions is less likely to treat one relationship as their entire emotional world. That independence can create a different psychological impression. Their attention feels chosen rather than required. They are with you because they want to be with you, rather than because they have nothing else. This does not mean you should deliberately create distance. It means you should continue developing a life that exists beyond the relationship. Confidence works in a similar way. Confidence is often misunderstood as being dominant, emotionally cold, or difficult to impress. Real confidence can look much quieter. It can mean being comfortable with yourself when another person disagrees with you. It can mean accepting rejection without immediately questioning your worth. It can mean communicating your needs without begging for approval. When confidence comes from internal validation, you have less reason to perform for attention. You can appreciate someone's interest without becoming dependent on it. Social status can influence perceived value in certain environments as well. People often observe how others respond to a person before forming their own judgments. Reputation, competence, social connections, and the ability to contribute meaningfully can influence perception. But status is only one part of the picture. Someone can have impressive social standing and still be emotionally unstable, unreliable, or disrespectful. In close relationships, those qualities eventually become difficult to hide. Emotional stability can therefore become more important than surface-level status. A person who can handle disagreement without collapsing into anger, panic, or desperation often creates a stronger sense of security. Personal boundaries add another layer. Boundaries communicate where your responsibility ends and another person's responsibility begins. You do not have to answer every demand immediately. You do not have to accept disrespect simply to preserve connection. You do not have to explain every personal decision. When boundaries are communicated calmly and maintained consistently, they show that your attention and emotional energy have limits. This can increase respect because people understand that access to you comes with standards. The crucial difference is between being valuable and pretending to be unavailable. Pretending is a performance. It requires constant calculation. You wait before replying because you want to appear important. You post things designed to create jealousy. You disappear while checking whether the other person noticed. You act indifferent while secretly hoping for a reaction. That behavior can create short-term uncertainty, but it keeps your attention locked onto the other person. You are still being controlled by the outcome. Genuine value requires far less performance. Build your life. Protect your time. Develop competence. Maintain your standards. Regulate your emotions. Give attention because you choose to give it. Step away when a situation becomes unhealthy. Stay consistent instead of becoming unpredictable for effect. When your life has substance, you do not need to manufacture scarcity. Your attention naturally becomes more selective because your life already contains meaningful priorities. That is the deeper psychology behind perceived value. The goal is never to make yourself artificially difficult to access. The goal is to become someone whose time, attention, presence, and emotional energy are given with intention rather than desperation. Silence can reveal information that constant communication often hides, because when every uncomfortable moment is immediately filled with words, there is very little room to observe what people naturally do. In a relationship, conversations can become a constant stream of explanations, reassurance, apologies, promises, questions, and emotional reactions. One person says they care. The other says they care too. Someone promises to change. The other promises to understand. The conversation continues, emotions settle, and the relationship returns to its familiar pattern. Yet the deeper behavior may remain unchanged. This is why stepping back can sometimes provide information that another argument never could. When you stop filling every silence, you create space to observe behavior without constantly influencing it. The first thing to notice is who reaches out when you stop initiating everything. If you have always been the person starting conversations, checking in, asking how someone is doing, and keeping the connection alive, your absence creates a natural test of reciprocity. You do not need to announce the test. You do not need to disappear dramatically. Simply stop doing more than your share and observe what happens. Does the other person notice the change? Do they make an effort to reconnect? Do they ask how you are? Do they attempt to continue the relationship? These behaviors can provide useful information because effort becomes visible when one person stops supplying all of it. Another important pattern appears in the reasons people contact you. Some people reach out because they genuinely want connection. Others appear mainly when they need emotional support, advice, attention, validation, favors, or reassurance. This does not automatically make someone manipulative. Everyone has moments when they need help. The important factor is the pattern over time. If contact repeatedly appears only when the other person wants something and disappears when their need has been satisfied, that pattern tells you more than a powerful conversation about how much they value you. Silence can also reveal how someone responds to boundaries. A healthy person may respect your need for space even when they dislike it. They may ask for clarification. They may give you time. They may return to the conversation when both people are calmer. A person who depends heavily on access may respond very differently. They may become angry because they are accustomed to immediate attention. They may demand explanations. They may create guilt. They may accuse you of changing simply because you stop being constantly available. The reaction itself becomes information. You begin seeing how the person handles situations where they cannot immediately control the interaction. This is where behavioral observation becomes powerful. Instead of focusing entirely on what someone promises, you begin looking at repeated patterns. Words matter, but patterns often carry more information. Someone can say they respect your boundaries while repeatedly crossing them. Someone can say they care while consistently disappearing when you need support. Someone can promise better communication while continuing the same behavior. The goal is not to become suspicious of everyone. The goal is to stop allowing isolated statements to outweigh months of repeated behavior. There is also a subtle psychological advantage in becoming a better observer. When you are emotionally involved, you may unconsciously search for evidence that supports what you hope is true. You remember the affectionate message and forget the repeated periods of disrespect. You focus on the apology and overlook the behavior that required the apology in the first place. You remember the promise and ignore the pattern. Stepping back can reduce that emotional noise. You gain enough distance to ask a simpler question. What consistently happens when words are removed? This does not mean every silence should become an experiment. Relationships are not laboratories, and people are not machines that produce predictable reactions. Someone may fail to reach out because they are busy, overwhelmed, uncertain, or respectful of your space. Context always matters. A single response should never become a final judgment about someone's character. What matters is repeated behavior across time and different situations. Patterns become meaningful when they continue even after circumstances change. The most revealing moment can come when you stop trying to control the outcome. You stop arguing to force understanding. You stop explaining yourself repeatedly. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop trying to convince someone to value the relationship. Then you watch. Who moves closer naturally? Who respects your distance? Who makes an effort without being pushed? Who only reacts when they feel their access disappearing? Who communicates because they genuinely want connection? Those answers may be uncomfortable, but they can also be clarifying. Silence becomes valuable because it removes some of the noise and gives behavior room to speak for itself. The strongest shift rarely happens because of one silent day. It happens when your behavior changes so consistently that the other person can no longer explain it as a temporary mood. At first, a woman may simply notice that you are quieter. She may think you are busy. She may assume you are upset. She may expect you to return to the old pattern, because that pattern is familiar. If you always chased after distance, she may expect you to chase again. If you always explained yourself after conflict, she may expect another long explanation. If you always reacted immediately, she may expect another emotional response. But when that response never comes, and the new behavior continues calmly over time, the psychological impression can begin to change. This is where behavioral consistency becomes important. Human beings learn about each other through repeated behavior. One unusual action can be dismissed as an exception. A repeated pattern becomes information. If you suddenly become quiet for one evening and then return to your old habits the next morning, very little has changed. But if you consistently stop chasing, stop over-explaining, stop reacting instantly, and stop seeking reassurance, people eventually have to update their understanding of you. The person they thought they could predict begins behaving differently. The old pattern becomes unreliable. That can create curiosity, but more importantly, it creates a new perception of your emotional boundaries. You are no longer responding automatically to every change in attention. If she becomes distant, you do not immediately chase. If she becomes emotional, you do not instantly become defensive. If she questions your intentions, you do not write paragraphs simply to prove that you are worthy of understanding. If communication becomes disrespectful, you do not keep fighting for the last word. Your behavior becomes slower, calmer, and more deliberate. This does not mean becoming cold. It means removing the desperation from your responses. You still communicate when communication matters. You still show care when care is genuine. You simply stop allowing anxiety to make every decision for you. That change can be surprisingly noticeable because people become accustomed to emotional patterns. If someone has learned that a certain behavior always produces a certain reaction from you, your consistency in changing that reaction creates a new dynamic. They may test the old pattern without realizing it. They may say something that previously made you defensive. They may expect an explanation. They may wait for you to repair the distance. When you respond differently, the old pattern stops working. The important point is that you are not trying to make the person feel powerless. You are simply refusing to keep participating in a cycle that no longer serves you. This is where your attention becomes intentional rather than automatic. Automatic attention is given because you feel pressure to give it. Your phone vibrates, and you respond immediately. Someone becomes distant, and you chase. Someone questions you, and you begin explaining. Someone becomes cold, and you become more available. Intentional attention works differently. You decide where your time and emotional energy belong. You respond because you choose to, rather than because you are afraid of what might happen if you do not. That difference can completely change the way you carry yourself. Independence becomes visible through behavior as well. You continue working toward your goals. You maintain your friendships. You protect your routines. You develop interests that have nothing to do with the relationship. Your emotional world becomes larger than one person's attention. This creates a natural form of confidence because your identity is supported by more than one connection. You are able to care deeply without becoming consumed. You are able to enjoy someone's presence without treating their absence as a crisis. And this is the moment when the other person may begin realizing that you are different. The change is rarely one dramatic move. It is the accumulation of small decisions. You no longer chase every unanswered message. You no longer explain every boundary. You no longer beg to be understood. You no longer need to prove that you deserve attention. You become more selective about where you invest yourself. Over time, that consistency communicates more than a speech ever could. It says that your behavior is no longer controlled by emotional pressure. The deeper lesson is that behavioral consistency works both ways. If you become calm for a week and then return to desperate behavior the moment you fear losing someone, the old pattern comes back immediately. Real change requires repetition. Your emotional control has to remain present when you are disappointed, ignored, criticized, or uncertain. That is when another person can genuinely see that the difference is real. You are no longer performing confidence. You are practicing it. You are no longer pretending to be unavailable. You simply have a life, standards, boundaries, and priorities that prevent you from giving unlimited access to your attention. That is the point where silence stops being a tactic and becomes evidence of a deeper change in who you are. Silence can become dangerous when the goal behind it changes. There is a major difference between becoming quiet because you need emotional space and becoming quiet because you want another person to suffer. From the outside, both can look like distance. Inside the relationship, the psychological meaning can be completely different. Healthy silence can create room for reflection. Weaponized silence creates pressure. It is designed to produce a reaction. The person may want the other individual to become anxious, guilty, frightened, desperate, or willing to apologize simply to restore communication. At that point, silence is no longer about emotional regulation. It has become a method of control. This darker form of silence can begin with something that seems small. A disagreement happens. Instead of discussing the issue, one person suddenly withdraws. Messages are seen but ignored. Questions receive no answer. Attempts to communicate are met with complete silence. The other person begins wondering what they did wrong. They may replay the argument repeatedly. They may send another message, then another. They may apologize even when they are unsure what they did. The silence becomes a psychological pressure system because the person on the receiving end is trying to escape uncertainty. Communication becomes a reward that can be given or removed. The longer the withdrawal continues, the stronger the emotional pressure can become. This is where punishment enters the dynamic. A person may think, if I ignore her long enough, she will understand what she did. But healthy relationships require communication about boundaries and consequences. Punishment creates a different pattern. The goal becomes making someone feel the pain of losing access. Instead of saying what caused the problem, the person withholds communication and waits for the other person to become uncomfortable enough to surrender. An apology may eventually arrive, but it may come from fear rather than understanding. That distinction matters because forced compliance can create temporary peace while leaving the real problem untouched. Prolonged social exclusion and withdrawal have been studied because human beings are deeply sensitive to being ignored or pushed outside a social connection. When people cannot understand why they are being excluded, the experience can become especially difficult because they are left without a clear explanation. Questions begin multiplying. Am I still valued? Did I do something wrong? Is this relationship ending? What can I do to fix it? When silence becomes a repeated method of creating those questions, emotional distress can increase. The relationship begins teaching the person that connection can disappear whenever the other person wants to create pressure. Emotional dependency can make this even more damaging. If someone already depends heavily on another person's approval, prolonged silence may feel overwhelming. They may begin checking their phone constantly. They may become desperate for a response. Their mood may depend on whether the other person replies. This creates an unhealthy cycle where one person controls access to communication and the other person becomes increasingly focused on regaining it. The more anxious person becomes, the more powerful the silence can feel. This is exactly why using psychological knowledge as a manipulation strategy can become destructive. The desire to create insecurity can also appear in more subtle forms. Someone may deliberately become warm, then cold, then warm again. They may provide attention and suddenly withdraw it. They may disappear after creating emotional closeness. The uncertainty can keep the other person mentally engaged because they are constantly trying to predict which version of the relationship will appear next. But emotional unpredictability is very different from genuine mystery. A healthy connection can contain space, individuality, and independence while still providing basic emotional security. This brings us to the most important distinction in the entire subject. Emotional control means controlling your own behavior. Manipulation means trying to control another person's emotional state. If you are angry, emotional control means deciding how you will respond to that anger. If someone disrespects you, emotional control means deciding what boundary you will set. If someone becomes distant, emotional control means deciding whether you want to give the situation space. None of these require making the other person panic. None require withholding communication as punishment. None require creating insecurity to prove your value. Real strength becomes visible when you can walk away without needing the other person to suffer because of your decision. You can create distance without monitoring their reaction. You can stop chasing without hoping they become desperate. You can end an argument without needing the final word. You can leave an unhealthy relationship without turning your departure into a psychological performance. That is a much deeper form of power because your emotional state is no longer dependent on whether the other person feels guilty, anxious, or afraid. The darkest mistake is believing that making someone emotionally uncomfortable proves that you have control. It may prove that you have influence, but influence and emotional strength are different things. Anyone can provoke fear. Anyone can create uncertainty. Anyone can disappear to make another person chase. The harder skill is remaining calm enough to choose behavior that protects your dignity without deliberately damaging someone else's emotional stability. When silence comes from that place, it becomes a boundary rather than a weapon. And the difference can determine whether distance creates clarity or leaves emotional damage behind. The real art of silence begins when you stop thinking about silence as a strategy for making someone chase you. The goal is not to ignore her until she becomes anxious. The goal is to stop giving automatic access to your attention. There is a major difference between these two mindsets. One keeps your attention focused on another person's reaction. The other brings your attention back to yourself. When you stop responding automatically, you begin making decisions based on intention instead of pressure. You answer because you genuinely want to answer. You speak because the conversation has value. You step away because the situation requires space. You remain quiet because reacting in that moment would only make things worse. Silence becomes less about controlling another person and more about controlling the way you participate in the interaction. Automatic attention can become a habit before you even realize it. A message arrives, and you respond immediately. Someone becomes distant, and you send another message. Someone questions your feelings, and you begin explaining. Someone becomes angry, and you rush to repair the situation. Someone withdraws affection, and you work harder to earn it back. Over time, this can create a pattern where another person's behavior determines your behavior. Their mood becomes your mood. Their attention becomes your source of reassurance. Their distance becomes your emergency. Emotional independence begins when that pattern breaks. Responding intentionally does not mean becoming cold. You can still be warm. You can still care. You can still communicate openly. The difference is that your response comes from choice. If a conversation matters, you have it. If someone deserves an honest explanation, you provide one. If emotions are too intense, you can take time before continuing. This pause can protect both people from words spoken during anger or fear. A delayed response can sometimes create clarity because emotional intensity has time to decrease. You are giving your judgment a chance to catch up with your feelings. There are also moments when silence communicates a boundary more clearly than another argument. If someone repeatedly disrespects you, endless explanations rarely create respect. If someone continues crossing a boundary after you have communicated it clearly, your next step may need to be distance. This does not require dramatic announcements. You can simply reduce your participation in the unhealthy pattern. You can stop arguing about the same issue. You can stop defending yourself against accusations that have already been answered. You can stop trying to convince someone to treat you well. Your behavior becomes the boundary. Remaining calm when someone tries to provoke you is another form of silence. Provocation often works by creating an emotional reaction. Someone says something designed to trigger anger, jealousy, insecurity, or defensiveness. The immediate urge is to respond. You want to correct them. You want to prove them wrong. You want to defend your reputation. Yet responding from that emotional state can give the other person exactly what they wanted. Calmness interrupts the cycle. You do not have to answer every accusation. You do not have to win every disagreement. Sometimes the most powerful response is to refuse to become a version of yourself that someone else is trying to create. Walking away when respect disappears is also part of the art. Emotional independence means understanding that connection is valuable, but connection is never worth abandoning your basic dignity. You can love someone and still leave an unhealthy dynamic. You can miss someone and still refuse to return to the same pattern. You can care about their feelings while protecting your own boundaries. Distance becomes meaningful when it is based on self-respect rather than revenge. The deepest shift happens when your life continues whether someone gives you attention or takes it away. Your goals continue. Your work continues. Your friendships continue. Your routines continue. Your personal growth continues. You do not spend every hour waiting for a message or trying to decode someone's behavior. Their attention becomes one part of your life rather than the center of it. That is emotional independence. It means you can appreciate connection without becoming dependent on constant access to it. And this is why silence, when used correctly, can become a form of strength. You are no longer trying to make someone wonder where you are. You are building a life where you do not need to constantly explain where you are. You are no longer trying to appear valuable by withholding attention. You become selective because your attention already has value. You are no longer disappearing to create fear. You are creating space to protect your peace. The difference is subtle, but psychologically it changes everything. Silence becomes powerful when it comes from a person who has learned that attention is something to give intentionally. Communication is something to use wisely. And emotional control begins with the ability to govern your own reactions. Silence can change a relationship, but the deepest change happens when silence changes you. Throughout this video, we have seen how attention creates expectations, how sudden distance can create uncertainty, and how silence can reveal relationship patterns that constant communication often hides. When you stop chasing, you begin to see who makes an effort. When you stop over-explaining, you begin to see who respects your boundaries. When you stop reacting instantly, you begin to understand the difference between emotion and action. And when you build a life beyond one person's attention, the entire dynamic can change. But there is one lesson that matters more than all the psychological techniques combined. Silence is powerful, only when you control yourself. If you become silent simply to make someone panic, you are still controlled by their reaction. If you disappear only to make someone chase you, you are still waiting for their response. If you withhold attention because you need proof that you matter, your emotional power is still in someone else's hands. Real control begins when you no longer need to create a reaction. The strongest silence is not designed to make someone suffer. It is designed to make you stop abandoning yourself. You stop chasing reactions. You stop begging for reassurance. You stop explaining your worth to people who have already decided how they want to treat you. You stop turning every unanswered message into an emergency. You stop allowing someone else's mood to determine your emotional state. You learn to pause. You learn to observe. You learn to walk away when respect disappears. And most importantly, you learn to stay connected to yourself even when someone else becomes distant. That is emotional independence. You can care without chasing. You can love without losing yourself. You can communicate without over-explaining. You can create distance without using it as punishment. You can remain calm when someone tries to provoke you. You can accept that some people will leave, some will return, and some will reveal their true intentions only after you stop doing all the work for them. Because sometimes the truth does not need to be forced out of someone. It simply needs enough space to reveal itself. So the next time someone becomes distant, remember this. You do not have to panic. You do not have to chase. You do not have to prove your value. Take a breath. Step back. Observe the pattern. Control your response. Let behaviors speak louder than promises. Your silence does not need to be a weapon. It can be a boundary. It can be self-respect. It can be emotional discipline. And sometimes, it can be the moment you finally realize that protecting your peace is more important than winning someone's attention. If this video gave you a new perspective on silence, emotional control, and human behavior, make sure you like the video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful psychology, relationship, and emotional control content. Stay connected because the more you understand human behavior, the less controlled you become by it.